In the heart of a vast galaxy, there was a powerful empire ruled by an empress whose name struck fear into the hearts of even the most fearsome creatures. The empress was known for her strength, her intelligence, and her control over armies of dangerous beings. Her empire spanned countless planets, home to species of unimaginable power. Yet there was one secret she kept hidden from the galaxy: the baby dragons. These dragons were no ordinary creatures. Born from ancient eggs, they were massive, fire-breathing, and almost impossible to control. Their scales shimmered like molten metal. Their eyes burned with fierce energy, and their claws could shred anything in their path. The dragons were meant to be the ultimate weapons, creatures bred for battle and destruction. The Empress had raised them in secret, hoping to use their power one day to solidify her rule. However, raising dragons was no simple task. Despite their size, these baby dragons were still wild, unpredictable, and difficult to handle. They would roar and thrash, their fiery breath scorching everything in sight. The Empress knew that they would become great warriors in time, but right now they were a constant source of chaos in her palace. The Empress had tried everything to tame them. She brought in the best caretakers from across the galaxy, beings known for their great strength, wisdom, and calm demeanor. These were alien species from planets known for their power, creatures who had once defeated entire armies with ease. Surely they would be able to control a few baby dragons, right? But the dragons weren't interested in being controlled. The first few caretakers tried their best, but it didn't take long for them to realize they were out of their depth. The dragons would growl and snarl, hissing and snapping their jaws whenever someone approached. The caretakers tried to train them with discipline, using methods that had worked on every other creature they had encountered. But it was useless. The dragons were too wild, too untamable. Some of the caretakers tried to use force, hoping that a display of strength would intimidate the dragons into submission. But the dragons only became more aggressive. One dragon, a massive beast with ruby-red scales, almost set an entire wing of the palace on fire with a single furious roar. Another dragon, smaller but no less fierce, had shredded the arm of one of the caretakers when he attempted to hold it still. The palace was in chaos. The caretakers were frightened, the Empress was frustrated, and the dragons were getting more difficult to handle by the day. And then, in the midst of this disaster, the Empress had an idea. She had been hosting a diplomatic mission from a distant planet, and among the guests was a human family. The human diplomats had come to the Empire for trade talks, bringing their young daughter Emma along for the journey. Emma was a small child, just a few years old, but she had a bright smile and an infectious laugh that seemed to light up any room she entered. She was curious, fearless, and had a way of making everyone around her feel at ease. The Empress had seen Emma play with some of the younger alien children in the palace, and the way Emma's laughter filled the room had caught her attention. Perhaps, just perhaps, the human child might be able to do what no one else could. Perhaps she could bring a sense of calm to the dragons. It was a long shot, but at this point the Empress was willing to try anything. "Bring the human child," the Empress ordered her aides. "I want to see if she can handle the dragons." And so Emma was brought into the palace to meet the baby dragons. The moment Emma entered the room, the dragons took notice. They stopped their chaotic growling and staring, turning their heads to look at her. Their eyes, glowing with fire and energy, focused on the small human child. The caretakers stood back, their faces filled with doubt. Emma, however, did not appear frightened. She simply giggled and waved her tiny hands in the air, as if she were trying to play. The dragons, their fiery breath still crackling, blinked in confusion. One of them, a black-scaled dragon, let out a soft, curious growl. The human child giggled again, louder this time, and took a step forward. The dragon's eyes followed her, still unsure what to make of her. Emma crawled toward the nearest dragon, a blue-scaled creature that was about the size of a small building. Instead of cowering or running away, Emma touched the dragon's leg and smiled up at it. The dragon tilted its head, studying the child with a mix of curiosity and confusion. And then, Emma did something unexpected. She laughed. A loud, joyful laugh that echoed through the room. The baby dragon, still unsure of what was happening, blinked again. Its growl softened, and it took a small step backward. The other dragons watched in silence, confused by the strange noise. Emma's laughter was like nothing they had ever heard before. It was not the sound of fear or distress, but of joy, and it was infectious. Slowly, the blue-scaled dragon lowered its massive head and nudged Emma gently with its nose. Emma laughed even louder, a sound full of happiness and light. The other dragons began to stir. Intrigued by this strange little human who was not afraid of them, they inched closer, sniffing her curiously. The caretakers, watching from a safe distance, could not believe their eyes. Was this actually happening? Were the dragons reacting to the child's laughter? They had tried everything: discipline, force, intimidation, but nothing had worked. Yet here was a tiny human girl with nothing more than her laughter and innocence, bringing calm to the wildest of beasts. The Empress, standing in the doorway, watched the scene unfold with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. This was something she had never expected. Could it really be this simple? Could a human child with her innocent joy be the key to calming the baby dragons? For the first time in days, the room was quiet. The dragons, once fierce and uncontrollable, were calm. They lay down on the floor, curling around Emma like oversized puppies, their fiery breath no longer a threat. And as Emma giggled again, her small voice filling the room, the Empress smiled. Maybe, just maybe, there was more to this human child than anyone had ever imagined. The Empress had never imagined that a human child would be the answer to her problems. For years she had ruled with strength, using fire-breathing dragons, alien warriors, and unmatched intelligence to control her empire. She had always believed that power was the key to maintaining order. But now, watching the tiny human girl Emma laughing with her baby dragons, the Empress started to wonder if she had been wrong all along. The news spread quickly through the palace. The once fearsome dragons which had terrorized their caretakers and the palace staff were now calm and peaceful. Emma's laughter seemed to have a magical effect on the creatures, turning chaos into calm. But what was more surprising was how the dragons began to interact with the little girl. They were no longer the uncontrollable beasts they had once been. Instead, they followed her lead, responding to her playful giggles and gentle touches. As Emma continued to spend time with the dragons, something strange began to happen. The alien caretakers, who had once feared the dragons, started to notice how their behavior was changing. The dragons, who had been aggressive and unpredictable, were now responding to Emma's warmth and laughter. It wasn't long before the caretakers began to wonder if they could learn something from this child, something that might help them deal with the dragons in the future. One alien, a large muscular being with scales like polished metal, stood in the doorway watching Emma with wide eyes. His species, known for their strength and calmness, had always been able to control any creature they encountered except for the dragons. But now the dragons were behaving like tame animals, resting their massive heads on Emma's lap as she played with them. The alien caretaker, named Vark, had been the one to first suggest that they needed to use force to control the dragons. He had believed that the dragons would only respond to strength. But now he was watching a human child do what no one else could. She was making the dragons laugh too. Vark was astonished. He had never seen anything like this in all his years of service. How does she do it? Vark muttered to himself, scratching his head in confusion. The other caretakers stood quietly behind him, also watching Emma with wide eyes. The Empress, who had been observing from a distance, walked over to the group of caretakers. She had seen the transformation in her dragons, but she still could not believe what was happening. "Do you see it?" she asked, her voice soft yet filled with wonder. Vark nodded slowly. "Yes, Your Majesty. I have never seen anything like this before. The dragons, they are responding to her in ways we never thought possible." "Do you think it is her laughter?" the Empress asked, almost as if she were speaking to herself. Could it really be that simple? Vark didn't respond right away. He watched as Emma playfully crawled toward a dragon that had been especially difficult to handle in the past, a red-scaled creature with fierce eyes. Instead of retreating or becoming defensive, the dragon nuzzled Emma with its snout and she giggled, petting it gently. "It is more than just laughter," Vark said thoughtfully. "It is the way she is not afraid. She does not view them as monsters, but as friends. She sees them for who they are, not what they can do." The Empress nodded. She had been so focused on control and power that she had forgotten the simple power of connection. Emma had approached the dragons not with fear or authority, but with acceptance and trust. And somehow that had worked where force had failed. As the days went by, Emma and the dragons grew even closer. Emma would spend hours each day with the baby dragons, talking to them, laughing with them, and even teaching them new games. The dragons, in turn, began to mirror her actions. They would chase her around the palace, playfully nudging her with their snouts and sometimes even rolling over on their backs. much like house pets. The Empress began to see the baby dragons in a new light. They weren't just weapons of destruction. They were living creatures with personalities, emotions, and a need for connection. Emma, with her innocent joy, had unlocked something in them that had been dormant for so long. But not everyone was happy with this change. The Empress had always relied on her dragons to intimidate her enemies. The sight of her mighty beasts, roaring and breathing fire, had struck fear into the hearts of those who would challenge her. She had planned to use the dragons as a show of power during the upcoming summit with other galactic leaders. The baby dragons had been her trump card, the ultimate weapon to solidify her dominance over the galaxy. But now, with the dragons acting more like pets than war machines, the Empress began to question whether they would still have the same impact. She had invited powerful leaders from across the galaxy to the summit, and their expectations were high. They had come to see the might of the Empress's dragons, to witness their strength and power. What would they think when they saw them rolling around and playing with a human child? The Empress was torn. She knew that the galaxy respected strength above all else, and she had built her empire on that principle. But she also knew that Emma had done something no one else could. She had created a bond with the dragons that no amount of force could ever replicate. If she showed the galaxy her dragons as they were now, gentle, playful, and calm, would it make her seem weak? As the summit grew nearer, the Empress felt the weight of this decision bearing down on her. She knew that her reputation was on the line, but she also knew that she couldn't ignore the changes that Emma had brought to her dragons. The little human girl had done something extraordinary, something that no one else had been able to do. Emma had unlocked the dragons' true potential, not as weapons of war, but as symbols of connection and trust. The Empress stood in front of the window, gazing out at the palace grounds where Emma and the dragons played together. She could hear the child's laughter echoing in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace. Perhaps it was time to show the galaxy something new. With a deep breath, the Empress made a decision. She would show the galaxy her dragons not as terrifying creatures of war, but as beings capable of love and loyalty. She would introduce Emma to the summit as her companion and the key to understanding the true power of the dragons. The galaxy might not understand at first, but the Empress knew one thing for sure. There was more strength in connection than in fear, and if Emma could teach the galaxy that, then perhaps humanity was more powerful than anyone had ever realized. The palace was buzzing with preparation. The Grand Intergalactic Summit was just days away, and leaders from across the galaxy were expected to arrive. The Empress had always used her dragons as symbols of fearsome strength, a reminder to all that she was a ruler not to be challenged. But as the summit approached, she faced a difficult decision. How would she present her dragons now? Emma had done something that no one else could. Through laughter and play, she had softened the dragons, turning them from wild, terrifying beasts into creatures capable of affection and even humor. The dragons, once known for their destructive power, now seemed like oversized puppies rolling on their backs and chasing Emma through the palace halls. It was a sight that no one, not even the Empress herself, could have predicted. But the Empress still feared how the galaxy would react. Would the galactic leaders see her as weak? Would they respect her as they had before? Or would they think she had lost control over her empire's most powerful creatures? Emma's laughter had changed everything. The Empress knew that, but she also knew that showing this side of her dragons might not go over well with the leaders who expected to see fire and fury, not playful pets. The Empress was torn between wanting to showcase her strength and the unexpected connection that Emma had created. In the days leading up to the summit, Emma and the dragons spent more and more time together. She had become their friend, their companion, and their trusted caretaker. The dragons, who had once been uncontrollable, now listened to her commands without hesitation. She had become a leader in her own right, though she was only a child. One morning, as Emma played with the dragons in the palace garden, the Empress watched from a distance. The sight was both beautiful and confusing to her. She saw the dragons rolling playfully in the grass, their massive bodies blocking out the sun, while Emma ran between them, laughing and calling them by name. The dragons responded in kind, their fiery eyes softening as they nuzzled the girl with affection. The Empress took a deep breath. She had never seen anything like this. The dragons, the mighty creatures she had relied on for strength and power, were behaving like domesticated animals, and it was all thanks to a human child. Could this be the future? Could the galaxy be ruled not by fear and force but by connection, humor, and understanding? The Empress wasn't sure. But as the day of the summit grew closer, she knew she had to make a choice. The dragons could not be hidden away, and she couldn't simply pretend they were the terrifying creatures they once were. There was something deeper at play now, something she couldn't ignore. The summit began, and delegates from various alien species gathered in the grand hall of the palace. The atmosphere was tense with anticipation. The Empress had planned to showcase her dragons as a powerful display of her empire's might. But as the leaders filed in, she could see their expectations written on their faces. They expected a show of strength, not an exhibition of affection. The Empress entered the hall with a composed expression, but inside her heart was racing. She had made her decision. She would show the galaxy the new side of her dragons, and she would do it with Emma by her side. As the leaders took their seats, the Empress stepped forward, her eyes scanning the room. Her voice was calm and commanding, as always, but there was a trace of uncertainty in her tone. "I welcome you all to this summit," she began, "and today I wish to show you something that you may not expect. My dragons are not just weapons. They are not merely tools for war. They are living creatures capable of more than you can imagine." The room fell silent. The delegates exchanged looks, uncertain of what they were about to witness. They had come expecting a show of force, and now the Empress was talking about connection. At that moment, Emma entered the room, her small form surrounded by the baby dragons. They walked behind her like loyal companions, their massive bodies moving gracefully through the hall. The leaders gasped in surprise. These were the dragons they had heard so much about, the same dragons that had terrified the galaxy for years. Yet they were not snarling or roaring. They were calm, almost playful. Emma, without hesitation, walked up to the Empress and stood beside her. The dragons followed her, their eyes soft and trusting. The Empress motioned for Emma to approach the central platform, and the little girl did so without fear. She smiled and waved at the audience, her laughter filling the room. The dragons, once dangerous and uncontrollable, now sat on their haunches around Emma. They looked at her with warmth in their eyes, their fiery breath no longer threatening but gentle. It was clear to everyone in the room that Emma had formed an unbreakable bond with them. She was not their master, nor their caretaker in the traditional sense. She was their friend. The galactic leaders, still stunned, watched in silence. The Empress spoke again. "These dragons are not merely soldiers," she said, her voice firm but soft. "They are individuals, each with their own personality, their own needs. And what they need more than anything is connection. My dragons are as capable of love as any creature in this galaxy, and it is through understanding them, not controlling them, that we can unlock their true power." The leaders exchanged glances, their skepticism beginning to fade. They had come to see the dragons as tools, as weapons to be wielded, but now they saw something different. The Empress had shown them that the true strength of the dragons lay not in their ability to destroy, but in their ability to form bonds with others. The connection between Emma and the dragons was not just an example of strength through unity, it was a new kind of power altogether. As Emma played with the dragons, her laughter echoing through the hall, the leaders began to understand. The Empress had not lost control of her dragons. She had found a new way to wield their power, a way that relied on trust, friendship, and connection rather than fear and domination. The summit continued, but the focus had shifted. The Empress no longer had to prove her strength through brute force. Instead, she had shown the galaxy that true power came from understanding and empathy. The dragons, who had once been feared, were now symbols of a new era, an era where strength was defined by connection, not destruction. By the end of the summit, the leaders of the galaxy were no longer afraid of the Empress's dragons. They saw them for what they truly were, majestic creatures with hearts full of love and loyalty. And they saw the Empress for who she really was, a ruler not just of power but of understanding. And in the midst of it all, Emma laughed, her giggles carrying through the air like a melody. It was a sound that would forever change the galaxy. In this third part, the Empress begins to accept that her dragon's true power lies not in their ability to destroy, but in their capacity for connection. Emma's influence on the dragons becomes evident, and the Empress makes a bold choice to showcase the dragons in a new light during the summit. The galaxy's leaders are shocked by the change, but they begin to understand the power of empathy and connection. The story takes a turn as the dragons are seen as more than just weapons. They are symbols of a new, stronger kind of power. The summit was in full swing, and the grand hall of the Empress's palace buzzed with excitement. Leaders from all over the galaxy had gathered to witness a historic moment. They had come expecting to see demonstrations of strength, displays of military power, fleets of ships, and fearsome weapons. But what they saw was something entirely different. The Empress had shown them a side of her dragons that no one had ever imagined. The baby dragons, once symbols of destruction, now lay peacefully around the Empress and her human companion, Emma. The massive creatures, their scales gleaming in the light, played happily with the little girl. They followed her every move, their fiery breath soft and controlled, as if they were mere pets rather than the terrifying monsters they had been known as. The leaders watched in awe. Some were skeptical, others confused, but all of them were intrigued. The Empress had managed to do the unthinkable. She had turned her most feared weapons into symbols of peace and connection. The galaxy had always valued power above all else, but now they were seeing something else entirely. A ruler who had mastered the art of understanding and empathy. But as the summit continued, the Empress felt a growing unease. While the leaders were fascinated by the dragon's transformation, there were whispers of concern among her closest advisors. The galaxy was not a place that embraced change easily, and not all of the Empress's allies were happy with her new approach. There were those who believed that showing her dragons as gentle, playful creatures was a sign of weakness. As the Empress spoke with the galactic leaders about trade and alliances, her mind kept returning to one thing: the growing unrest in the galaxy. There were factions, powerful factions, who did not see strength in empathy and connection. They saw weakness. They believed that the Empress was softening, that her rule was no longer as absolute as it once had been. And these factions, unlike the leaders in the summit hall, were not interested in peaceful alliances. They wanted control. The Empress had always known that there were enemies out there who would stop at nothing to undermine her power. But she had hoped that the summit, with its focus on cooperation and peace, might bring a new era of stability. Instead, it seemed to be attracting those who would see her newfound kindness as a vulnerability. That night, as the summit attendees enjoyed a grand feast, the Empress withdrew to her private chambers. She paced back and forth, her mind racing with thoughts of the future. She had to remain vigilant. The galaxy was changing, and she had to decide if she was going to be a part of that change or if she would continue to rule with the old ways. Fear and strength. Emma, sensing her concern, entered the room with a smile. She had been playing with the dragons in the garden, her laughter still ringing in the air. The baby dragons had been following her around, rolling in the grass and playfully nipping at her heels. "Your Majesty," Emma said, her voice full of innocence. "The dragons are so happy. They really like playing with me." The Empress looked down at the child, her heart softening. Despite the mounting pressure and uncertainty, Emma's presence brought her a sense of peace. It was hard to believe that such a small human could have such a profound impact on the galaxy's most powerful creatures. "They are," the Empress said, her voice distant. "But I fear that not everyone will see it that way." Emma's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" The Empress sighed, walking to the window that overlooked the palace grounds. "There are those in the galaxy who want to see me fail. They believe that I have grown weak, that my connection with the dragons is a sign that I have lost my power. They see strength in domination, not in understanding." Emma looked up at the Empress, her innocent face filled with determination. "But the dragons aren't weak. They just need to be understood." The Empress smiled, her heart swelling with pride for the child. "You are right, Emma. But there are forces at work that do not believe in the power of understanding, and soon we may face a challenge we cannot avoid." As the night wore on, the Empress's fears seemed to be realized. A message arrived from one of her distant allies, a warning. A large fleet of warships had been spotted in a nearby sector, and intelligence suggested that they were heading straight for the palace. The Empress's heart sank as she read the message. The faction that had been growing in power, one that believed in control through fear, had made their move. They were going to test her, to see if the galaxy would follow a ruler who used compassion instead of force. The Empress immediately called her closest advisors into a war council. She knew that if she was to defend her empire, she would need her dragons. But could she trust them to fight when they had been raised to be peaceful? To be companions rather than warriors? Could she force them back into the role of weapons after all Emma had done to show them love and care? The advisors argued. Some said they needed to fight, to show the galaxy that the Empress's strength had not waned. Others, including Vark, the alien caretaker who had grown fond of Emma's approach, suggested that perhaps the dragons could help in a different way, by showing the power of connection even in battle. Perhaps the dragons could protect the palace without resorting to destruction. The debate raged on until the Empress made her decision. She would meet the approaching fleet with the dragons, but she would not use them as weapons of war. Instead, she would rely on the bond she had forged with them, the bond that Emma had helped create. The dragons would be the defenders of her palace, but not through fire and fury. They would protect, but not destroy. As the warships approached the palace, the Empress stood on the balcony looking out over the horizon. Emma stood beside her, her hand resting gently on the back of one of the dragons. The baby dragons, once so wild and uncontrollable, now stood strong and proud, their eyes focused on the approaching threat. They were ready to defend, but they were not ready to fight out of fear. The Empress's heart pounded in her chest. She had made her choice. Now it was time to see if the galaxy would accept her vision of strength, not through domination but through understanding. The first shots fired from the enemy ships. They had come to test her, to see if she would bend to their will. But the dragons, with Emma's laughter echoing in their minds, did not react with violence. They shielded the palace with their massive bodies, their scales shimmering like armor against the incoming blasts. The warships fired again, but the dragons stood firm, their bodies absorbing the blasts as if they were nothing more than rain. And then, as the enemy ships began to retreat, the Empress smiled. The dragons had defended the palace not through destruction, but through their unshakable bond with her, and with Emma. It was a victory, not of power, but of understanding. The battle was over, but the real war was just beginning. Would the galaxy accept this new form of leadership? Would they learn that true strength was not about domination, but about connection? For the Empress, the answer would come soon enough. But for now, she stood with Emma, watching as the dragons turned their fiery eyes toward the stars. The battle had ended, but the consequences of the Empress's decision were just beginning to unfold. The enemy fleet had retreated, their ships damaged by the protective barrier formed by the dragons. The palace stood unharmed, and the Empress had proven to the galaxy that her dragons were not mere tools of destruction, but beings capable of defending her empire in a new way. Through strength, yes, but also through understanding and compassion. However, as the Empress looked out over the palace grounds, she knew that the real challenge lay ahead. The galaxy had witnessed a shift in her leadership, and while some had been impressed, others were skeptical. There were those who still believed that true power came from domination, and they would not be easily convinced that the Empress's vision of strength was the right path. The summit had ended, and the leaders of the galaxy had returned to their home planets. Some had expressed admiration for the Empress's dragons and her bold new approach to leadership. Others, however, were not so easily swayed. They saw her decision to rely on empathy and connection as a sign of weakness. The growing faction that opposed her had become bolder, and it was clear that they would not back down easily. But the Empress knew one thing for certain: she had made the right choice. The dragons, once feared for their destructive power, had shown that there was another way to rule. It wasn't about fear or force, it was about understanding. And if she could teach the galaxy that lesson, then she would have truly changed the future. In the days following the summit, Emma and the dragons continued to grow closer. Emma had become an integral part of the palace, her laughter and energy filling the halls. The dragons, who had once been wild and untamable, now looked to her as a guide. They followed her every move, and their fiery breath, once a symbol of destruction, now seemed like a gentle warmth. The Empress spent more time with Emma and the dragons than she had ever imagined. She watched as the little girl played with the dragons, her innocence and joy spreading like light through the palace. The dragons, for their part, had become more than just companions. They had become symbols of the Empress's vision for a new future, one where strength was not measured by fear, but by the bonds formed between beings. Despite the calm on the surface, the Empress could feel the tension in the galaxy growing. The faction that opposed her had been quiet for a time, but their influence was still strong. They were not willing to let go of the old ways of rule, and they would stop at nothing to bring the Empress down. It wasn't long before the Empress received word of a new threat. The rival faction had begun to rally their forces, preparing for another attack. This time, however, the Empress was ready. She had learned from her previous encounter. The dragons had shown her that true power didn't come from overwhelming force, but from knowing when to act and when to stand firm. She gathered her advisors and began planning a new strategy. The dragons, though peaceful, were still powerful, and with Emma's guidance they had learned how to defend without destroying. The Empress knew that she had to act decisively, but not in the way the galaxy might expect. "We will not fight with fire and fury," the Empress said, her voice calm yet firm, "but we will not back down. The galaxy will see that there is another way to lead. We will face this threat with the strength of understanding." Vark, the alien caretaker who had seen the transformation in the dragons firsthand, spoke up. "Your Majesty, the dragons will stand with you. They will protect the palace, but not through destruction. They will defend the people not as weapons, but as guardians." The Empress nodded. She had come to trust the dragons, and she had come to trust Emma. The bond they shared was powerful, and it was the key to her new vision of leadership. As the rival fleet approached, the Empress stood on the balcony of her palace, looking out toward the horizon. The dragons stood beside her, their massive forms casting long shadows on the ground. Emma, holding the hand of one of the dragons, stood beside the Empress, her small face full of determination. The enemy fleet arrived with great fanfare, their ships glowing with the promise of destruction. The Empress had anticipated this, but she would not be intimidated. The dragons, sensing the danger, stood tall and strong, their eyes glowing softly with a quiet power. They were ready, but they were not angry. They were calm, focused, and ready to protect. The Empress raised her hand, signaling to the dragons. They immediately moved into position, forming a protective circle around the palace. Their scales shimmered in the light, creating a barrier of strength and warmth. The enemy ships fired their first round of blasts, but the dragons stood firm, their bodies absorbing the impact like a shield. The palace remained untouched. The Empress stepped forward, her voice echoing across the courtyard. "You seek to destroy what we have built, but you cannot destroy understanding. You cannot destroy the bond we share." The enemy ships hesitated. They had expected a response of violence, but instead, they faced a wall of strength made not of weapons, but of connection. The dragons were not attacking, but they were not backing down either. They stood their ground, powerful in their calmness. As the enemy fleet continued to hesitate, the Empress spoke again. "This is the future. Not a future of fear and destruction, but one of peace and understanding. It is a future where strength is measured not by force, but by the bonds we form. You may not accept it, but the galaxy will." The enemy fleet, seeing that their attacks were having no effect, slowly began to retreat. The dragons remained in position, their gaze unwavering, but they did not pursue. The battle had been won, not with destruction, but with the power of unity and understanding. In the days that followed, the Empress's message spread across the galaxy. Her victory was not one of violence, but of compassion and strength. The rival faction, seeing the power of the Empress's vision, began to lose support. The galaxy, once ruled by fear, began to embrace a new way of leadership, one where empathy and connection were the true sources of power. The Empress stood with Emma and the dragons, looking out over the galaxy she had saved. The road ahead would not be easy, but the Empress knew that with the dragons by her side and Emma's laughter echoing in her heart, the future was bright. For the first time in a long time, the Empress felt at peace. She had not only defended her empire, but she had shown the galaxy that there was a better way to rule, a way that embraced connection, compassion, and understanding. And with that, the Empress knew that humanity's future and the future of all the galaxy was one where true strength came from the heart.